In this video, we'll look at every person executed in the United States in 2019. We'll walk through the crimes that put them on death row, the final words they spoke, and the last meals they requested before facing execution. But before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. On January 30th, 2019, Robert Jennings was executed by lethal injection in Texas. But the story behind that sentence began more than 30 years earlier in Houston, Texas. On July 19, 1988, Officer Elston Howard and his partner were making a routine check of adult bookstores in Houston when they stepped into a place called Mr. Peepers. It was supposed to be simple. Elston was just writing up a citation for a licensing violation when the front door swung open and Robert Jennings walked in with a gun in his hand. And he wasn't there by accident. He had robbed the same place just 12 days earlier. But this time, things didn't go as planned. In less than a minute, 4 gunshots tore through the air and Elston collapsed. He never even had a chance to reach for his own weapon. Robert fled the scene, but his story didn't start that night. In fact, he had only been out of prison for 2 months, where he was serving a 30-year sentence for aggravated robbery before being released on parole. And that wasn't his first time in trouble. He had already been to prison for robbery before that. In his 2 months of freedom, he'd gone on a robbery spree across Houston. 10 businesses were hit, one after another. But this time, it ended in blood. During the chaos inside Mr. Peepers, Robert was shot in the hand and drove himself to a hospital, thinking he might buy himself some time. But police were already looking for him, and he was arrested right there at the hospital. When questioned, he confessed on tape, saying he regretted what happened. But by then, the damage was already done. A year later, in 1989, a jury found Robert guilty of capital murder, and it took them less than an hour before the judge handed down the death sentence. He would spend the next 29 years on death row, his legal team trying every possible appeal, arguing his attorneys failed him at trial, pointing to childhood trauma, brain damage, and his own words of remorse. But every court, from Texas to Washington, D.C., shut the door. He got a stay once in 2016, but it didn't last. On January 30th, 2019, Texas carried out its first execution of the year. Robert wasn't allowed to choose a special last meal and ate what the other prisoners had that day. When strapped to the gurney, Robert asked a chaplain if he knew the name of the officer he killed. When the chaplain didn't respond, his final words were, "To my friends and family, it was a nice journey. To the family of the police officer, I hope this finds you peace. Be well and stay safe. Enjoy life's moments, because we never get them back." At 6:33 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Robert Mitchell Jennings was 61 years old. Oof, that crime was cruel, and that was only the beginning. Let's continue with the next execution scheduled just 8 days later. But what did he do? It was July 15, 1995, in Selma, Alabama, when 15-year-old Tiffany Harville vanished without a trace. She had $6 in her pocket and was on her way to a workshop that evening, but she never came home. Her mother, Mary, returned from a work trip to find Tiffany missing and immediately called the police and started to look for her. One of the first people to check in on her was 19-year-old Domineque Ray. He handed out missing persons flyers, offered reward money, and even called to ask how Mary was holding up. He acted like a concerned friend. But despite all the search efforts, Tiffany never came home. Then, about a month after she disappeared, there was finally a break. A tractor driver cutting weeds near County Road 62 spotted something hidden in the tall grass. When forensics arrived, they confirmed the worst. It was Tiffany. Her body had been left out in the open, abandoned like she didn't matter. Even though time and the elements had worn her down to skeletal remains, investigators still found the evidence they needed. 12 stab wounds, all visible on her skull. But after that, the case quickly went cold and 12 years passed. But then, in 2007, a man named Marcus Ouden came forward. He told the police that he and Domineque Ray had been talking about starting a gang, and part of their twisted plan involved finding Tiffany that night. They had already discussed what they would do. First, they would ask her for sex. Then, when she refused, they would force her. And that's exactly what happened. Afterward, when Tiffany was broken and defenseless, they stabbed her. But according to Marcus, it was Domineque who eventually slit her throat. Afterward, they took her underwear and her purse with the $6 inside it. But Marcus didn't stop there. He had something else to confess, and it made everything even darker. It turned out Tiffany wasn't their first victim. Back on February 4th, 1994, brothers Ernest and Reinhard Mabbins were shot and killed inside their own home, their lives stolen over something senseless. They had refused to join a gang that Domineque and Marcus were trying to start. And for that, they were murdered. Marcus confessed to everything, and in early 1999, before the trial for Tiffany's murder ever began, Domineque was already convicted of killing the Mabbins brothers. He was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Eventually, Domineque confessed to all the crimes, though he tried to make Marcus seem like the one in charge. But the jury wasn't buying it. In September 2007, Domineque Ray was sentenced to death. During sentencing, Domineque's defense barely held together. His lawyers called just one witness, his mother. That was it. Even after Domineque gave them a list of names, hoping someone might speak on his behalf, most refused to come forward. But later, during the appeals process, pieces of Domineque's past started to surface. The courtroom heard about abuse, abandonment, mental illness, and even suicide attempts. His brother, Europe, finally testified, describing how they grew up surrounded by trauma. But the court still believed the brutality of Tiffany's death outweighed any suffering from Domineque's past. In his final days, Domineque tried to delay the execution, claiming his religious rights were violated because Alabama wouldn't let his Muslim spiritual advisor into the chamber. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected that claim just hours before the execution, though his imam was allowed in the witness room. On February 7, 2019, after spending 19 years on death row, Domineque refused a special final meal. For breakfast, he had eggs, prunes, milk, and biscuits, but skipped the last tray. Before the drugs flowed, he looked toward the witnesses and raised his finger in a silent prayer. He gave a brief faith declaration in Arabic. At 10:12 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Domineque Ray was 42 years old. And just 3 weeks later, another inmate faced the same fate. But what did he do? Let's take a look. It was August 29, 1989, when Billie Coble walked into his in-laws' neighborhood in Waco, Texas, with a loaded gun and a plan for revenge. He had already kidnapped his estranged wife, Karen, once, jumping out of the trunk of her car with a knife, dragging her to a field, and telling her that if he couldn't have her, no one could. She talked him down that time, and he let her go. But just 9 days later, Billie came back, and this time he wasn't planning on leaving anyone alive. That afternoon, he handcuffed Karen's daughters and her nephew, taped their mouths shut, and cut the phone lines. Then he waited. As each of Karen's family members returned to their homes, her father, her mother, and her brother Bobby, who was a police officer, Billie ambushed and killed them one by one. Then he returned to Karen's house, told the children what he'd done, and waited for Karen to get off work. When she walked through the door, Billie stepped out from the bedroom with a gun. "I've killed your mama, your daddy, and your brother," he said. He showed her Bobby's gun, her father's truck parked outside, and $1,000 in stolen cash. He then told her to kiss her daughters goodbye. He forced her into his car, warning that he planned to torture her for weeks. But as he drove, Karen managed to slip one hand free from the cuffs. She grabbed the steering wheel and jerked it hard, sending the car crashing into a ditch. She got hold of one of his guns and pulled the trigger, but it didn't fire. Enraged, Billie beat her until she couldn't see through the blood. A passing woman yelled for him to stop, so he drove off again. But as they passed a sheriff's patrol car, Billie suddenly began stabbing Karen in the face. Then, in one final act of violence, he slammed the vehicle into a parked car, trying to end both their lives in the crash. The police quickly pulled Karen from the wreckage, barely alive, while Billie was still in the driver's seat, clutching her father's wallet and 2 guns. And what came out afterward was even more disturbing. Billie had a long history of violence. He had beaten both of his ex-wives and molested several young girls, including his own relatives. His first wife once testified that he warned her, "If you leave me, I'll fix you so no one else will want you." His second wife said he once beat her with a sledgehammer. And even as a teen, the warning signs were there. At 15, a psychiatrist described him as paranoid and hostile toward women and said he had no self-control. His Marine Corps records showed the same story: violent outbursts, a self-inflicted stab wound after a fight with a girlfriend, and a chilling note in his file. His future doesn't look good. In 1990, a jury sentenced Billie to death for the triple murder. He spent 29 years on death row, and during all that time, he never picked up a single disciplinary infraction. Other inmates said he helped them write letters, mentored younger prisoners, and even started a prison sports league. When his final appeals came, his attorneys argued that he had changed, that his spotless record proved he was no longer a threat. But the jury didn't agree. They believed he still carried the same explosive anger that had driven him to kill. On February 28, 2019, Billie Coble became the oldest person executed in Texas since the modern death penalty resumed. He wasn't allowed a special last meal, so he ate the same thing the other inmates had that day. And just before the drugs were injected, he cracked a joke. "Yes, sir, that will be $5, he said. Then he looked at his family. "I love you. Take care." At 6:24 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Billie Wayne Coble was 70 years old. That was just brutal. Now let's fast forward to April 2019, when the next death row inmate was scheduled to be executed. What did he do to deserve the death penalty? In the early hours of June 7, 1998, John William King and 2 other men pulled up beside 49-year-old James Byrd, Jr., who was walking home alone in Jasper, Texas. They offered him a ride, which he accepted. What followed was one of the most brutal hate crimes in modern U.S. history. The 3 men, John King, Lawrence Brewer, and Sean Berry, drove him down a remote road. Then they jumped him, beat him unconscious, chained his ankles to the back of their truck, and dragged his body for nearly 3 miles along the pavement. James was still alive when the dragging began, but was torn apart long before the truck finally stopped. When it was over, they left what was left of him outside an African-American cemetery, abandoning him like he was nothing. Then they drove off to a barbecue, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, a motorist made the horrifying discovery: James's decapitated remains lying by the side of the road. Investigators found 81 locations where pieces of James's body had scattered across the pavement. Along the stretch where he had been dragged, police found a wrench with "Berry" written on it and a lighter inscribed with "Possum," the prison nickname that belonged to John King. Given that both Lawrence and John were known white supremacists, state officials quickly ruled the murder a hate crime. John had plans to start a new chapter in Jasper, and prosecutors argued that James's murder was meant to send a brutal public message. In 1999, both John and Lawrence were convicted and sentenced to death. Lawrence was executed in 2011, and in 2019, after spending 2 decades on death row, it was John's turn. John wasn't given the chance to order a special last meal. That right had already been taken away. After his buddy Lawrence Brewer ordered a huge feast, then refused to eat a single bite, Texas changed the rules. From that point on, death row inmates would get whatever the rest of the prison was eating that day. Nothing more, nothing less. When the moment came, John had no final words. John William King was executed by lethal injection in Texas on April 24, 2019, at 6:56 p.m., and pronounced dead 12 minutes later. He was 44 years old. Just 1 week later, Georgia had its first execution of 2019. Let's find out what this man did and what his final moments were like. On December 29, 1994, Scotty Morrow stormed into a home in Gainesville, Georgia, armed and angry. His girlfriend, Barbara Young, had finally reached her breaking point, and after months of abuse, she had started pushing back. Just days earlier, she told a neighbor that she was afraid Scotty would kill her, and she wasn't wrong. That day, Barbara was in the kitchen with two friends, Tanya Woods and LaToya Horn, while their children played nearby. Suddenly, Scotty burst through the door. He started yelling, not at Barbara, but at Tanya. Then he pulled out a handgun and shot her in the stomach. The bullet separated her spine, leaving her paralyzed, but she was still alive. Then he turned and shot LaToya too. Barbara tried to run, but Scotty chased her down, cornering her in a bedroom. She fought back, struggling to escape. During the chaos, the gun went off again, and this time, it hit Barbara. Wounded but still alive, Barbara ran for the hallway, but Scotty caught her again. Forensic evidence later showed her head was slammed into a doorframe before he shot her in the head at close range, execution style. Her left hand was raised in front of her face when the bullet passed through it. She died trying to protect herself. But Scotty wasn't finished. He returned to the kitchen and either cleared a jam or reloaded the gun. He shot Tanya in the head and shot LaToya again, this time in the face and arm, but she survived. Then he cut the phone line and fled the house, leaving behind two dead women, a severely injured survivor, and two children who had watched everything unfold. But he didn't get far and was arrested soon after. In March 1995, he was indicted on 2 counts of murder and several other charges. At trial, his defense team didn't deny the killings. Instead, they painted a picture of a man who snapped in a moment of rage. They described a violent childhood, beatings at home, humiliation at school, and a father who regularly abused his mother right in front of him. Psychologists testified that Scotty was emotionally unstable, impulsive, and prone to blackouts even as a child. But the prosecution pushed back hard. The jury didn't see a man who lost control. They saw a man who made choices, reloaded his gun, and made sure the job was done. In June 1999, he was sentenced to death. He spent the next 24 years on death row. On May 2, 2019, Georgia carried out the execution. Scotty requested a final meal of a hamburger with mayonnaise, 2 chicken and waffle meals, butter pecan ice cream, buttered popcorn, 2 beef franks, and a large lemonade. Before the drugs were administered, he offered a long, emotional final statement. He apologized directly to the families of Barbara Young, Tanya Woods, and LaToya Horn. He said he was truly sorry, asked for forgiveness, and told his own family he loved them. "Holding anger and hatred in your heart only hinders you," he said. "I love you all. God bless." At 9:38, he was pronounced dead. Scotty Garnell Morrow was 52 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On March 22, 1997, in the quiet town of Pelham, Alabama, 4 lives were taken in a brutal and calculated attack that would leave a permanent scar on 2 families. 19-year-old Michael Samra, along with his 16-year-old friend Mark Duke, walked into his father's home with murder on their minds. Mark had come up with the plan after an argument with his father, Randy, over using a pickup truck. And Michael went along with it, armed, ready, and without mercy. As soon as they stepped inside, Mark shot his father in the head, and Michael turned the gun on Randy's fiancée, Deidre Hunt, shooting her in the face. Bleeding, Deidre ran upstairs with her 2 daughters, 6-year-old Chalisa and 7-year-old Chelsea. She tried to lock them inside a bathroom, but it didn't stop what came next. Mark kicked in the door and shot Deidre again, killing her in front of her children. Then, out of bullets, he grabbed 2 knives. He dragged Chalisa from behind the shower curtain and slit her throat. Chelsea tried to hide under the bed. She fought back, desperate to survive, but it wasn't enough. Mark held her down, and Michael cut her throat. By the time it was over, 4 people were dead, 2 adults and 2 little girls. Michael fled with Mark, but it didn't take long for police to track them down, and they confessed to everything. In 1998, Michael was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He was just 19 years old at the time of the crime. From the beginning, his legal team fought to save his life. They argued that his age should have mattered, that at 19 he was still a teenager, not fully developed, with a brain that science now says keeps changing well into the early 20s. They pointed to Mark, the one prosecutors called the mastermind behind the crime. Mark was only 16 at the time and avoided the death penalty because of a Supreme Court ruling that bans executions for anyone under 18. Michael was just 3 years older, but in the eyes of the law, those 3 years changed everything. His attorneys filed motion after motion. They asked the governor for a reprieve, the Supreme Court for a delay. They pleaded science, they argued fairness, they spoke of justice. But every request was denied. After 21 years on death row, Michael's execution date was set. On May 16, 2019, at Holman Correctional Facility, the curtains opened just after 7 p.m. Michael smiled. He declined breakfast and did not request a final meal or any other final accommodations. His final words were a prayer. "I would like to thank Jesus for everything He's done for me. I want to thank Jesus for shedding His blood for my sins. Thank you for your grace, Jesus. Amen." At 7:14 p.m., his eyes closed. He took a few heavy breaths. His hands twitched. Then, stillness. At 7:33 p.m., Michael Brandon Samra was pronounced dead. He was 42 years old. But that wasn't all for that day. At the same time, another execution was carried out, this time in Tennessee. But what did he do to deserve the death penalty? Let's take a look. On December 8, 1984, inside a camping equipment store in Memphis, Tennessee, Donnie Johnson murdered his wife, Connie. And it wasn't in a moment of rage. This was calculated. They were alone in the back office when he attacked. He didn't use a weapon, at least not one you'd expect. Instead, he suffocated Connie by forcing a large plastic trash bag down her throat. She couldn't scream and she couldn't breathe. Connie fought, but Donnie held her down until her body went still. It was slow, personal. And when it was over, he didn't call for help. Instead, he began to cover his tracks, working to erase what he'd done, while the woman he claimed to love lay lifeless in the room behind him. After the murder, Donnie flagged down a work-release inmate who happened to be at the store that day. Calm and composed, he convinced the man to help him move what he claimed were boxes. Just inventory, nothing unusual. The inmate had no idea he was helping carry a body. Together, they loaded Connie into her own van. Donnie then drove it to a nearby shopping mall and left it parked there, as if it were just another abandoned vehicle. Her body wasn't discovered until the following morning. When police found Connie, they brought Donnie in for questioning the very next day. And like so many before him, he played dumb. Claimed he had no idea what had happened. Said maybe she was attacked, maybe she was robbed. But whatever it was, he swore he had nothing to do with it. The lies came easy, polished, practiced. But the truth was already beginning to unravel. The details didn't line up, and the crime scene told a different story. There was no forced entry, and there was nothing missing. There was just one woman dead in the back of her van, and one man, the man she trusted, who just happened to be there when she died. Eventually, it was the work-release inmate who cracked the case wide open. At first, he hadn't realized what he'd been part of. But when the truth came out, when Connie's body was found and questions started circling, he came forward and told the police everything. Donnie's motive wasn't entirely clear, but one detail stood out. He had told a coworker that he and Connie had been talking about a divorce. Donnie had been through several divorces before and said he couldn't afford another one. But that was only part of the story. There was also the life insurance. Legal records showed that more than a year and a half before Connie's death, she'd taken out a policy, and Donnie was listed as the primary beneficiary. After the murder, not only did Donnie file a claim for the $50,000 payout, but so did his sister. Donnie was arrested almost immediately. But the problem wasn't catching him. It was getting the justice system to follow through. He was sentenced to death in 1985, barely a year after the murder. But from there, the delays began. His execution was set for 2006, but a federal court stepped in just days before, claiming they needed more time to review a complaint about a key witness. And then the delays stretched on. It took 35 years from the day Connie died until the day Donnie was finally executed. Over these decades, Donnie's story changed, and so did he, at least according to the people who knew him behind bars. He became deeply religious and led Bible studies. He was ordained as an elder in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he finally admitted that he had suffocated Connie. And in a twist no one saw coming, Connie's daughter, Cynthia, who once called him a monster, forgave him. She became one of his strongest advocates, begging the governor for mercy. But for the state, the crime still mattered most. Connie had no second chance. There was no space for redemption, no life left to rebuild. So the governor denied clemency. On May 16, 2019, Donnie declined a special last meal and asked the officials to use his $20 to buy a meal for the homeless instead. He also asked his supporters to donate meals to the homeless in his name. When asked for his final words, he spoke calmly. "I commend my life into your hands. Thy will be done. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen." Then, for 2 full minutes, he sang, and then his voice went silent. Donnie Edward Johnson was pronounced dead at 7:37 p.m. He was 68 years old. And just a week later, another death row case made headlines, this time in Florida. Between March and November 1984, women across the Tampa Bay area began to vanish with a terrifying rhythm. 10 women in total, all found the same way: raped, murdered, and dumped like garbage along roadsides. The killer had a pattern. He targeted young women, some hitchhiking, others walking home. A few were lured in by phony ads for furniture sales. He moved fast and left behind almost nothing, just pain and silence. For months, it seemed like he would never be caught. But then, something small broke the case open: red carpet fibers. They showed up on several of the victims' bodies, all traced back to his car. And while most of his victims didn't make it out alive, one did. Just after 2 a.m. on November 3, 1984, 17-year-old Lisa McVeigh wrapped up her shift at Krispy Kreme and started pedaling home on her bike. But she never made it. As she passed a quiet church along her route, a man stepped out from the shadows. He had a gun, a plan, and no mercy. Bobby Joe Long dragged Lisa off her bike and shoved her into his red Dodge Magnum. He tied her up, blindfolded her, and told her to shut up or die. What he didn't realize was that she was already thinking ahead. Lisa kept her jaw clenched while he fastened the blindfold, leaving just enough space to see. Through that narrow gap, she memorized details: the red carpet, the white seats, the word Magnum on the dashboard. Then, back at his apartment, Bobby raped her, over and over, but Lisa never gave up and made a plan. She was still blindfolded, so she couldn't see her attacker or his apartment. But instead, she touched his face, memorizing the shape of his mustache and nose, and when he let her use the bathroom, she left fingerprints on everything she could. And that was not it. She played the role of a girl who cared. She lied that her sick father needed her, and she offered to be his secret girlfriend. She did anything she could to survive. After 26 hours, Bobby felt bad for her and decided to let her go. He drove her near her home, told her to wait 5 minutes before taking off the blindfold, and left. Lisa didn't wait long. She tore off the blindfold and ran for her life. But when she made it home, what she found wasn't comfort. It was more pain. Her grandmother's boyfriend even accused her of cheating on him and beat her for it, refusing to believe the truth. But Lisa wouldn't stay silent. Bruised and shaking, she demanded to call the police. She gave them everything: the shape of his car, the feel of the carpets, the layout of the room, his face, his voice, every second she could remember. And when Sergeant Larry Pinkerton listened, things started to move. Lisa's story lined up perfectly with an open series of murder cases. 12 days later, police arrested Bobby Joe Long, but by then, 2 more women were already gone. their lives taken before the law could catch up. Still, it was Lisa's courage that cracked the case, her memory, her voice, her refusal to stay quiet. Because of her, Bobby's web of lies fell apart. And not long after his arrest, he confessed to everything. In 1985, Bobby pleaded guilty to 8 murders and to the abduction and rape of Lisa McVeigh. He was handed 26 life sentences. Then, in 1986, he was sentenced to death for the murder of Michelle Sims. Lisa, just a teenager when she cracked the case, later became a deputy sheriff and has worked in law enforcement ever since. Bobby Joe Long spent 34 years on death row. On May 23, 2019, he was executed by lethal injection in Florida. He had no last words. For his final meal, he requested roast beef, bacon, French fries, and a soda. Bobby was pronounced dead at 7 p.m. He was 65 years old. At the execution, Lisa sat in the witness room wearing a shirt with the text, "Long overdue." Wow, those crimes were just brutal. Now let's continue with the next one. It was a cold Sunday night, just days before Christmas, December 22, 1991. 57-year-old minister Bill Lynn had just come home from the church's evening service. His wife, Bessie, slipped into her pajamas, while Bill stayed in the living room, carefully wrapping toys for their grandchildren. It should have been a peaceful night, but then the lights flickered and went out. Assuming it was just a blown fuse, Bill stepped outside to check the power box. That's when Christopher Price struck. Hidden in the dark with an accomplice, Christopher ambushed him, armed with a sword and a knife. The attack was brutal. Bill was slashed, stabbed, and butchered in near silence. His arm was almost separated, and his scalp was peeled from his skull. In total, he was cut 38 times, not in panic, but with precision. Inside, Bessie heard the commotion and ran to call for help, but the phone lines were already cut. Desperate, barefoot, and in her nightgown, she ran outside, only to be forced out of their van at gunpoint and assaulted too. And Christopher didn't stop with the bloodshed. He and his partner ransacked their home, grabbing anything they could find. They took checks, cash, and firearms. They even stole Bessie's wedding rings from her hand. Bill died slowly, bleeding out in his yard, while Bessie survived. It didn't take long for investigators to close in, and Christopher confessed shortly after. In 1993, he was convicted of capital murder and first-degree robbery. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed, citing the cruelty of the crime. Christopher was 20 years old when he killed the minister, and he would spend the next 26 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal. In May 2019, after decades of litigation, including last-minute battles over execution methods, his sentence was finally carried out. On May 30th, Christopher declined breakfast, but asked for 4 pints of turtle pie ice cream as his last meal. At 7:11 p.m., the curtains opened at Holman Correctional Facility, and the warden read the death warrant. Christopher's final words were, "A man is much more than his worst mistake." After whispering a message for his wife, the drugs were administered. He was pronounced dead at 7:31 p.m. He was 46 years old. And while this execution in Alabama had just ended, another death row inmate was already waiting until it was his turn. But what did he do? It was a Thursday night in Milledgeville, Georgia, March 28, 1996. Donovan Parks had just finished a shift and stood outside a Walmart, ready to head home. He was a hard worker, working 2 jobs, one at a grocery store and the other as a prison guard. He was saving every dollar he could to go back to school. His dream was to become a counselor, someone who could help inmates turn their lives around. That night, he agreed to give a ride to someone he knew, Robert Butts, a former co-worker from his Burger King days. But Robert wasn't alone. He had another man with him, Marion Wilson. What Donovan didn't know was that both men were gang members. He didn't know there was a shotgun hidden nearby, and he had no idea that saying yes to that ride would become the last kind act he ever offered. As they pulled away from the parking lot, Donovan was in the driver's seat. Robert sat in the front passenger seat and Marion was behind them. Not long after, they told Donovan to pull over. Then, without hesitation, they forced him out of the car, ordered him to lie face down on the asphalt, and Marion raised the gun. He fired a single shot to the back of the head. Then they left him bleeding in the street, his body dumped like trash in a quiet neighborhood, and drove off in his car. Later that night, after trying and failing to sell the car, they set the car on fire, hoping the flames would erase what they'd done, but the damage was already done. 4 days later, police arrested Marion and Robert. Both pointed fingers at each other, but neither denied being there. The motive was as senseless as the crime itself. According to prosecutors, it was about status in their gang. A murder for clout. In 1997, a jury found Marion guilty of murder, and the judge handed down a death sentence. He was only 19 years old when he pulled the trigger and spent the next 21 years on death row, launching one appeal after another, including a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that sent his case back for reconsideration. But none of it changed the outcome. On June 20th, 2019, after 2 decades of delays, the state of Georgia carried out his sentence. For his final meal, he requested 1 medium thin crust pizza with everything, 20 buffalo wings, 1 pint of butter pecan ice cream, some apple pie, and grape juice. When strapped to the gurney, Marion declined to admit guilt, telling the room, "I ain't never took a life in my life." He looked at a woman in the witness area and smiled. His voice faded as the microphone was cut. His final words to family were simple: "I love y'all forever. Death can't stop it." At 9:52 p.m., Marion was pronounced dead. He was 42. His accomplice, Robert Butts, was executed on May 4th, 2018. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. On March 17, 1986, in Union County, Tennessee, 23-year-old Stephen West helped carry out one of the most brutal crimes in the state's history. That night, Stephen and 17-year-old Ronnie Martin forced their way into the home of Wanda and Sheila Romanes. And what followed wasn't just a murder. It was hours of torture. Wanda, the mother, was stabbed multiple times, and Sheila, only 15 years old, was raped and slashed 17 times before her body gave out. They both bled to death on the floor of their own home. Stephen and Ronnie had just finished a shift at McDonald's before they started drinking and made the drive to the Romanes' house. They weren't strangers. Ronnie had a history with Sheila, one rooted in rejection. She had turned him down in high school, but that night he told Stephen she'd sleep with him now. That excuse was all they needed. They knocked on the door, pretending they needed to borrow money. But once inside, everything changed. They tied up both women, separated them, and started the attacks. The forensic evidence showed just how brutal it was. Wanda was stabbed so hard her lung collapsed and her liver was torn. Sheila was cut, then stabbed in the heart, and both women had defensive wounds, showing they had tried to fight back. Their bodies were discovered later that evening by Wanda's husband and Sheila's father, Jack Romanes. The next day, police arrested both Stephen and Ronnie, and under pressure, they turned on each other. Ronnie pointed the finger at Stephen, saying he was the one who did the stabbing. But Stephen pushed back, claiming Ronnie had threatened him into helping and that he was too scared to say no. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic pathologists confirmed that more than one weapon had been used, and the wounds on the victim showed they were inflicted by 2 different people. The jury didn't buy Stephen's defense, and in 1987, he was convicted and sentenced to death. For the next 32 years, Stephen fought to escape that sentence. He filed appeal after appeal, arguing that he suffered from mental illness and continuing to insist that Ronnie was the real killer. But the courts didn't agree. By 2019, he had run out of legal options. Facing execution, Stephen made a final, unsettling choice. At the last minute, he declined lethal injection and chose Tennessee's electric chair instead. For his final meal, he asked for a Philly cheesesteak and fries. On August 15, 2019, Stephen was strapped into the electric chair. Before the switch was flipped, he said, "In the beginning, God created man, and Jesus wept. That is all. He was pronounced dead at 7:27 p.m. Stephen Michael West was 56 years old. Due to the fact that Ronnie was 17 years old at the time of the murder, he was ineligible for the death penalty in accordance with state law. As a result, he pleaded guilty to all counts, and he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. On December 8, 1999, in Montgomery County, Texas, 19-year-old Melissa Trotter walked out of her college library and vanished. The last person seen with her that day was Larry Swearingen, a 27-year-old electrician and newly married father. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but within days, investigators began to look closer, and Larry quickly became the prime suspect. Melissa's car was eventually found still parked in the library lot, untouched. Then came the cell phone data. Larry had been in or near the Sam Houston National Forest that same afternoon. It didn't look good. And just 25 days later, hunters stumbled across Melissa's body deep in those very woods. She had been strangled, left out in the elements, her body partially decomposed under the trees. As the investigation closed in, something else turned up. Larry's landlord had been cleaning around his trailer and found a piece of pantyhose lying outside. Investigators immediately noticed it seemed to match the torn section used to strangle Melissa, a critical piece of the puzzle that pointed right back to Larry Swearingen. Police had already searched that area twice before, and defense attorneys later called that discovery suspicious, questioning how something that obvious had been missed, but prosecutors saw it differently. To them, it was just one more thread tying Larry to the crime. Forensic evidence kept stacking up. Fibers from Larry's home, his truck, and even his jacket were found on Melissa's body. And in his truck, they found hairs consistent with hers. Then came the fake letter, a strange, desperate move. While in jail, Larry wrote a letter pretending to be a witness named Robin, someone who supposedly saw another man commit the murder. But the letter only made things worse. Prosecutors said it included details only the killer could have known, and that it backfired completely. Still, Larry insisted he was innocent. He claimed he had dropped Melissa off with another man and spent the rest of the day with his grandmother, who backed him up on the stand. She testified that he had driven her to the post office that afternoon. But when weighed against the physical evidence, the jury didn't buy it. What sealed it was a jailhouse informant who testified that Larry had confessed to the murder behind bars. In 2000, after a tense trial, Larry Swearingen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For the next 19 years, Larry fought to prove he couldn't have done it. His legal team dug deep, pointing to 5 forensic experts who all agreed on one thing: the body couldn't have been in the forest for more than a few days. That meant Melissa would have died after Larry was already in jail. Even the original medical examiner, who had once supported the state's version of the timeline, revised her findings. The science, it seemed, was shifting in Larry's favor. And there was more. DNA found under Melissa's fingernails didn't match Larry, raising another question mark. To the defense, it was all enough to cast serious doubt on his guilt. But the courts saw it differently. Again and again, appeals were denied, with judges pointing back to what they called a mountain of evidence. On August 21, 2019, at Huntsville Unit in Texas, Larry was strapped to a gurney. He wasn't allowed to choose a special meal and ate what was on the menu that day. Before the drugs flowed, he looked toward the ceiling microphone and said, "Lord, forgive them, they don't know what they are doing." Then he told witnesses he could taste the drug, said his arm was burning, and fell silent. He was pronounced dead at 6:47 p.m. Larry Swearingen was 48 years old. What do you think of this case? Was there enough evidence to convict him, or do you think he was innocent? Now let's continue, as just one day later, the next execution was carried out in Florida. On March 15, 1994, in Daytona Beach, Florida, 32-year-old Gary Ray Bowles claimed his first known victim. His name was John Hardy Roberts, a 59-year-old man who had opened his home to Gary, offering him a place to stay. But instead of gratitude, Gary repaid him with violence, beating and strangling John to death, then stealing his credit cards and vanishing. His fingerprints left behind would become the first clue in a trail of blood and betrayal that stretched up the East Coast. Over the next 6 months, 5 more men were killed in nearly identical ways. David Jarman in Maryland, Milton Bradley and Alberson Carter in Georgia, Albert Morris in northern Florida, and finally, Walter Hinton in Jacksonville Beach. The pattern was as clear as it was disturbing. Gary would offer himself for sex, gain his victim's trust, and once inside, he would turn on them. Each time he used his hands or whatever was nearby to beat, strangle, and kill, then took what he could and moved on. With each new murder, he crossed into a different state, always one step ahead of the police. That path of death, tied to the victim's proximity to Interstate 95, earned him his nickname, the I-95 Killer. That run came to an end on November 22, 1994, when Gary was arrested for the murder of Walter Hinton. Once in custody, he confessed to all 6 killings. According to Gary, it all started after a woman he was dating had an abortion, once she found out he had been prostituting himself to men. That decision, he said, broke something in him. He claimed he blamed gay men for the abortion, and he started lashing out, his rage fueled by a lifetime of trauma and rejection. But the details he gave investigators revealed something even darker. These weren't impulsive killings. Gary waited until his victims were vulnerable, then attacked with brutal precision. Walter Hinton was asleep when Gary smashed his skull with a concrete block, then shoved a towel down his throat to silence him, for good. Gary didn't just kill, he hunted, and he made sure no one walked away. In 1996, Gary pleaded guilty to Walter's murder and was sentenced to death. A year later, he admitted to killing John Roberts. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a hate-driven predator fueled by a deep-seated rage toward gay men. For the next 23 years, Gary sat on death row at Florida State Prison. By the summer of 2019, his appeals had run out, and a date was set. On the night of August 22nd, Gary chose a final meal: 3 cheeseburgers, French fries, and bacon. At 10:58 p.m., he was strapped to the gurney. He had no last words, but a written statement was read aloud after his death. In it, Gary apologized to his victims' families and to his own mother. "You don't wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer," he wrote. "I never wanted this to be my life." Gary Ray Bowles was 57 years old. With the August executions completed, the next one was scheduled for September 4th. Let's take a look at what this death row inmate did. On April 6, 2003, in Fort Worth, Texas, 48-year-old Billie Crutsinger knocked on the door of a quiet home. Inside were 89-year-old Pearl Magwork and her 71-year-old daughter, Patricia Siren. Billie wasn't a friend, he wasn't family, he wasn't even a neighbor. Just a drifter with nothing to lose and a violent streak that had only gotten worse with time. Once inside, Billie unleashed a brutal attack, stabbing both women to death in a frenzy that showed no mercy. After the murders, he tore through the house, ransacking everything, grabbing Patricia's credit card, snatching the keys to her Cadillac, and disappearing like he'd never been there. 2 days passed before anyone found their bodies. While detectives scrambled to make sense of the crime scene, Billie was already in Galveston using Patricia's credit card to fund his escape. But that one slip-up started to unravel everything. The stolen card left a digital trail, and investigators followed it straight to a cluster of local bars. When an officer finally spotted him, Billie gave a fake name, David. It bought him a few minutes, but not much more. Once in custody, Billie Crutsinger sat quietly in a holding cell, waiting for detectives from Fort Worth to arrive. When one of them stepped into the room, Billie looked up and simply said, "I messed up." What followed was a full confession, captured on tape. He told them everything: how he had killed the women, what he had taken, and where to find the rest of the evidence. He didn't fight it. He even gave them permission to search his bag and test his DNA. In October 2003, Billie went to trial. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For the next 16 years, he fought to stay alive. His attorneys filed appeal after appeal, arguing that his original lawyer had failed him, that no one had looked into lifelong alcoholism, head trauma, depression, or his low IQ. But none of it changed the outcome. The sentence stood. On September 4, 2019, Billy Crutsinger ate his last meal. He had the same thing the rest of the prisoners had. Later, inside the death chamber at the Huntsville unit, he said goodbye with a strange kind of humor. "I'm going to miss those pancakes and those old-time black and white shows. Where I'm going, everything will be in color." The drugs began flowing at 6:27 p.m., and 13 minutes later, he was gone. Billy Jack Crutsinger was 64 years old. The death chamber didn't stay quiet for long. Just 6 days later, another execution was already underway. But who was next, and what had he done to end up there? On June 29, 2010, in Godley, Texas, 29-year-old Mark Soliz shot and killed 61-year-old Nancy Weatherly inside her home during a robbery. It was the final act in an 8-day crime spree that left one other man dead, multiple people robbed at gunpoint, and a trail of fear stretching across the Fort Worth area. Mark and his accomplice, Jose Ramos, began the spree a week earlier with a gun store robbery. In the days that followed, they committed a string of carjackings, armed robberies, and 2 shootings, one of which claimed the life of delivery driver Ruben Martinez. Early that morning, they drove out of the city with a plan already in motion. Mark knocked on Nancy's door while Jose waited nearby. When Nancy answered, she didn't stand a chance. They forced their way inside, shoving her aside. Mark raised the gun and shot her in the back of the head, execution style. Then they grabbed what they could and fled, leaving Nancy dead on the floor of her own home. But their freedom didn't last long. That same day, both men were arrested. The evidence piled up fast, and Mark eventually confessed. He gave police the details, filling in the gaps no one else could. Prosecutors wasted no time. They charged him with capital murder. At trial, a friend of Mark's took the stand. He told the jury that Mark had bragged, boasting about killing an old lady like it meant nothing. Mark's defense team looked to his past, hoping the jury might see more than just the crime. They painted a picture of a childhood filled with neglect, violence, and chaos, physical abuse, and early heavy exposure to drugs and alcohol. Doctors testified that Mark suffered from fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a condition that can severely impact judgment, impulse control, and decision-making. They argued he was damaged long before the crime ever happened. But it wasn't enough. In March 2012, the jury found him guilty of capital murder and sentenced him to death. For the next 7 years, Mark sat on death row, filing appeal after appeal, trying to escape the sentence that had already been set in motion. But on September 10, 2019, his final day came. Mark wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and ate the same as the other inmates did. From the gurney, he addressed Nancy's family and apologized. "I wanted to apologize for the grief and the pain that I caused y'all," he said. "I don't know if me passing will bring y'all comfort, but I am at peace." He was pronounced dead at 6:32 p.m. after receiving a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Mark Soliz was 37 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. Just after midnight on September 15, 2007, Robert Sparks stood silently in the dark, staring down at his wife as she slept. Char Agnew was 30 years old, and she never had a chance to scream. Robert pressed his hand over her mouth and stabbed her repeatedly, 18 times, driving the blade into her as she fought to breathe. He left her bleeding to death in their bed while the rest of the house stayed quiet, still unaware of what was coming next. Then he turned toward the children. He walked into the bedroom where his 2 stepsons slept, innocent and unaware. He shook 9-year-old Harold awake, led him into the kitchen, and stabbed him again and again, at least 45 times. Then he went back for Raekwon and did the same. But the horror didn't stop there. After killing their mother and brothers, Robert crept into his 12 and 14-year-old stepdaughter's room in the dead of night. He tied them up, led them to the living room, and gave them a sick ultimatum. One of them had to have sex with him or they'd both die. LaKenya stepped forward, trying to shield her younger sister from whatever was coming. Robert raped her on the couch, right there in the living room. Then he did the same to Garisha, placing her next to her sister on the same couch. When it was over, he took a shower and made them sit in the bathroom with him while he apologized to them for the rape and the murders. Robert told them their mother had been poisoning him and that they were part of it too. That was the story he clung to, repeating it again and again, like if he said it enough, maybe it would become true. Then, in a final act of cruelty, he dragged the girls into the master bedroom, where Chare's body still lay. He forced them to kiss her face. Then he locked them in a closet and walked away. And just like that, he vanished. Robert drove to see his ex-girlfriend, Shunta Alexander, the mother of his teenage daughter, Brianna. He sat her down and confessed everything. Told her he'd killed Chare, murdered the boys, and that the girls were still alive, locked inside the house. Then, as if it was some casual business arrangement, he handed her a stack of cash for Brianna and said that if there was ever a reward for his arrest, Brianna should collect it. But Shunta begged him to call the police. Calmly, Robert dialed 911 from his cell phone, told the dispatcher he had killed his wife and her sons and locked 2 girls in a closet. He then gave them the address and said he couldn't stay on the line long because they'd traced the call. Then he hung up, smashed his phone, and vanished again. Later that morning, his cousin drove him to the Greyhound station, where he bought a ticket under a fake name and left town. But just a few days later, he was back in Dallas and reaching out to a detective. He asked if they had found the cassette tape he claimed to have left behind. According to Robert, the tape held his proof, evidence that Chare or one of the children had confessed to poisoning him. He truly believed it would save him. When police finally arrested him, Robert cooperated fully. He handed over blood, saliva, hair, and even fingernail clippings, convinced the lab would find toxins in his system. He even insisted that LaKenya and Garisha should be polygraphed, convinced they were part of it too. But none of the tests he demanded could be run, and even if they had, no poison was ever found. At trial, Robert's attorneys didn't deny what happened. Instead, they brought in experts who said Robert suffered from schizoaffective disorder and deep psychotic delusions. But the prosecution stuck to the facts, the graphic photos of the crime scene, the taped confession, and the testimony of the 2 girls who survived. That's what the jury held on to. In December 2008, a Dallas County jury convicted Robert of capital murder and sentenced him to death. On September 25, 2019, inside the Huntsville execution chamber, Robert addressed his family. "I'm sorry for the hard times," he said quietly. "I love y'all. I am ready." He wasn't allowed to choose a special final meal and had the same meal the other prisoners were having. At 6:39 p.m., he was pronounced dead from a lethal dose of pentobarbital. Robert Sparks was 45 years old. Just 6 days later, another execution was scheduled. But what did he do? And what did he choose for his final meal? Let's take a look. On March 21, 1996, in rural Missouri, Russell Bucklew crossed a line he couldn't walk back from. It had been 5 weeks since his girlfriend, Stephanie Ray, left him on Valentine's Day. Since then, he'd made her life a waking nightmare. He stalked her, beat her, even slashed her with a knife. She finally fled with her 2 children, moving into a trailer in Cape Girardeau County with her new boyfriend, Michael Sanders, and his own kids. But Russell didn't let go. That day, he stole his nephew's car, grabbed 2 pistols, a pair of handcuffs, and a roll of duct tape from his brother's house, and followed Stephanie to Michael's trailer. Michael met Russell at the door with a shotgun, but this wasn't enough to scare him off. Russell fired 2 rounds. One of them hit Michael in the chest and tore through his lung. Michael collapsed and bled out on the floor, dying in front of his children. Then Russell turned toward Michael's 6-year-old son and pulled the trigger again, but missed. He pistol-whipped Stephanie, handcuffed her, and dragged her from the home at gunpoint. In the car, as they drove north on I-55, he raped her. She begged him to let her go, but he didn't even hesitate. By the time they reached the outskirts of St. Louis, the highway patrol was on his trail. A gunfight broke out right there on the side of the highway. Both Russell and a trooper were shot, and somehow both survived. But even that wasn't the end of it. While sitting in jail, waiting for trial, Russell found a way to escape. And when he slipped free, he went straight back to Stephanie's family home. There, he attacked her mother and her mother's boyfriend with a hammer, bringing the nightmare crashing down on them too. It took another manhunt to bring him in again, and this time the state made sure Russell would never get another chance. In 1997, Russell was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He had been just 28 years old when he murdered Michael and abducted Stephanie. For the next 22 years, his case wound its way through the courts, not because he ever denied what he had done, but because he feared how he would die. Russell suffered from a rare medical condition called cavernous hemangioma, clusters of blood-filled tumors buried deep in his head and throat. He claimed that a lethal injection would rupture the tumors, causing him to drown in his own blood. He begged for a different method, nitrogen gas instead, but the courts weren't moved. His appeals were denied, and an execution date was set. On the morning of his execution, October 1st, Russell made his final requests. He ordered a big last meal, 2 sandwiches, fries, a cola, and a banana split. As the clock ticked down, he was given Valium to calm his nerves. Corrections staff raised the head of the gurney slightly, a quiet precaution in case one of his tumors ruptured during the execution. When asked if he had any final words, Russell stayed silent. He chose to meet the end without saying a thing, not even an apology. At 6:15 p.m., he was injected with pentobarbital, and 8 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Russell Bucklew was 51 years old. The next execution was scheduled for 1 month later, but what exactly did he do? On March 8, 1992, Charles Rhines waited until dark before slipping into the Rapid City donut shop where he used to work. Weeks earlier, he had been fired, and now, with no money and no real plan, he came back, using a key he had never returned. His mind was set on one thing: robbery. Inside, he moved quickly, grabbing cash from the registers and searching for anything else of value. But then, a door opened behind him. It was Donovan Schaefer, a 22-year-old employee who had just stopped by to pick up some supplies. He wasn't expecting anyone to be there, and he definitely wasn't expecting Charles. What followed was as cruel as it was calculated. Charles stabbed Donovan once in the stomach. The young man begged for his life, promised not to tell, even pleaded to be taken to a hospital. But Charles didn't listen. Instead, he tied him up and dragged him into a back storeroom. There, he stabbed him again and left him to bleed out alone. When it was over, Charles stole more than $3,000 and disappeared. Days later, he had the audacity to attend Donovan's funeral, standing among the grieving family and friends, before heading west to Seattle. But 3 months later, his freedom ran out. When police arrested him, Charles confessed to everything. No hesitation, no denial. Still, when the state offered to drop the death penalty in exchange for a plea, he refused. He wanted a trial. In January 1993, a jury listened to the brutal details and sentenced him to death by lethal injection. Charles would spend the next 26 years on death row, fighting a different kind of battle. In those decades, he became a symbol of controversy. His defense argued that it wasn't just the murder that sealed his fate. It was because he was gay. Evidence surfaced showing that during deliberations, some jurors expressed concern that if they sentenced him to life, he might actually enjoy being in prison around other men. That alone, his lawyers argued, helped tip the scales toward death. Years later, some jurors admitted it. One of them even said out loud, "If he's gay and we'd send him to prison, we'd be sending him where he wants to go." But despite the controversy, the courts refused to overturn the sentence. Charles would remain on death row until the very end. On November 4th, 2019, Charles sat down for his last meal. Fried chicken, cantaloupe, lefse, strawberry and cherry yogurt, licorice, cookies and ice cream, root beer, and coffee with cream and sugar. Just after 7:30 p.m., he looked toward Donovan's parents. "I forgive you for your anger and hatred." Then he thanked his lawyers. Charles Rhines was 63 years old. And if you thought this was shocking, wait until you hear what the next man did. On October 28, 2002, Justen Hall sat outside a known drug house in El Paso, watching as Melanie Bilhartz pulled up in her truck. She wasn't a stranger to the crowd, but she wasn't part of it either. Justen belonged to the Aryan Circle, a white supremacist gang, and he was no small player. In El Paso, he was district captain. People listened when he talked, and when Melanie got into an argument with one of his associates, Justen made a decision no one else saw coming. Melanie had to die. She had threatened to call the police after a scuffle with a man named Ted, a mistake she didn't realize was life-threatening in a house held together by drugs, violence, and fear. Justen took her, and hours later, he returned alone, driving her truck, her lifeless body, stuffed in the back. He didn't hide it and warned the others to stay away. He'd killed her, and he didn't want company. Then he forced Ted to come with him across the border into New Mexico. There, he made Ted hold a machete, forcing him to cut off Melanie's fingers, just to make sure no one could match her DNA from under her nails. When it was done, Justen dumped her body on the side of the desert road and drove off. By the next day, Justen had already admitted what he had done. He told a friend he had messed up and killed someone, even bragged about how he got rid of the body. He laughed, saying Ted got sick after being forced to cut off her fingers. But Justen's arrogance caught up with him. A few weeks later, police spotted him behind the wheel of Melanie's truck. At first, he tried to lie, claiming she was in Mexico and that he was just borrowing her truck. But under pressure, he cracked and confessed to everything. He told them he had used an extension cord from the drug house to strangle Melanie, wrapping it around her neck 3 times. When the autopsy report came back, it confirmed every brutal detail: multiple jaw fractures, a broken rib, and the mutilation of her hand. And chillingly, this wasn't Justen's first brush with murder. At the time he killed Melanie, he was already out on a $75,000 bond for another homicide, the killing of a transgender woman who identified herself as Arlene Diaz, a case that never even made it to full trial before Melanie's death overshadowed it all. Justen was sentenced to death in 2005 and spent 14 years on death row. On November 6, 2019, Justen Hall sat down for his final meal, eating the same food served to every other inmate that night. When the time came, he gave his final words. First, he apologized to Melanie's family, the weight of what he had done finally catching up to him. Then he turned toward his own family. "I love you, and I'm going to miss you all," he said. "I'm ready." At 6:32 p.m., Justen Hall was pronounced dead. He was 38 years old. Well, that was something. Now let's continue with the next execution. On the night of April 10, 1994, Ray Cromartie and a friend walked into a junior food store in Thomasville, Georgia, not for groceries, but for money. Behind the counter stood 50-year-old Richard Sliss, working the graveyard shift, just trying to make it through another long night. But moments after walking in, Ray pulled out a .25 caliber pistol and shot Richard twice in the head. The first bullet hit just beneath Richard's eye, but he didn't fall right away. He stayed conscious long enough to feel the second shot tear into his left temple, and then he collapsed behind the counter, bleeding out in the dark. While Richard lay dying, Ray and his friend fumbled with the cash register, trying to rip it open. When they couldn't, they grabbed 2 12-packs of Budweiser and bolted into the night. Across the street, a store clerk heard the gunfire and saw 2 figures running, Ray carrying the beer. One pack tore open as they ran, spilling cans across the pavement. A motorist passing by watched them vanish into the shadows. 3 days later, Ray was arrested. Investigators found his thumbprint on a torn beer carton. lying near fresh footprints pressed into the mud. They also tracked down the pistol, a .25 caliber he had borrowed just days earlier to shoot a different clerk, Dan Wilson, in the face. Dan survived, but Richard didn't. At trial, Ray's own accomplices turned on him. The jury listened as witness after witness recounted how Ray bragged about shooting both clerks, how he had talked days before about doing a 187, street slang for murder, and neighbors remembered him returning to the apartment with muddy beer. In 1997, Ray was sentenced to death. He spent 22 years on Georgia's death row. On November 13, 2019, he made no final statement. Instead, he asked for a prayer. For his final meal, he requested a feast. Steak, lobster, macaroni and cheese, cube steak with rice and gravy, a steak and cheese sandwich, a double cheeseburger with fries, ranch dressing, a strawberry milkshake, and a slice of layered cake with white icing. At 10:59 p.m., a lethal dose of pentobarbital ended his life. Ray Cromartie was 52 years old. That was a massive last meal. Let's see if the next inmate can top that. On April 16, 1991, in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Lee Hall was waiting as his ex-girlfriend, Tracy Crozier, got into her car. Their 5-year relationship had ended the month before, and she had moved in with her aunt, trying to start fresh. But Lee wasn't ready to let go. He had left her threatening messages, and he had already set her car on fire twice. But that night, things got worse. Lee didn't hesitate. He walked up to the driver's side with a plastic bottle full of gasoline, lit a homemade wick, and threw the flaming bomb at Tracy through her open window. The car immediately exploded in flames. Somehow, Tracy managed to open the door and crawl out, screaming. Her body was covered in fire, but at that moment, she was still alive. Doctors later said her burns were the worst they had ever seen. She was burned on 95% of her body. Hours later, Tracy died in unbearable pain. At first, Lee told police he only meant to burn the car, not kill her. But later he claimed he snapped when Tracy laughed at him and refused to get back together. He admitted he threw the gas bomb out of anger, but Tracy had already told others what she feared. She named Lee as the one who set her car on fire twice earlier that month, and her family said he'd been lighting things on fire since he was a child: beds, woods, anything within reach. In 1992, a jury found Lee guilty of first-degree murder and aggravated arson. He was sentenced to death and began what would become 27 years on death row. Over the years, his legal team argued that Lee had severe cognitive impairments and diminished capacity, but the courts weren't convinced. By the time he reached his execution date, Lee was completely blind, the result of untreated glaucoma in prison. He became the first blind inmate in modern U.S. history to die by electrocution. On December 5, 2019, Lee chose the electric chair over lethal injection, a choice available in Tennessee to inmates convicted before 1999. For his final meal, he asked for a Philly cheesesteak, 2 orders of onion rings, a slice of cheesecake, and a Pepsi. When asked for final words, he asked for water, but that request was denied. He paused, then said, "People can learn forgiveness and love and will make this world a better place. That's all I have to say." In a statement read by one of his attorneys after the execution, Lee asked for forgiveness from the family of Tracy, his ex-girlfriend. "I'm sorry for the pain I caused," his statement read. "I ask for your forgiveness, and I hope and pray that someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me." He also apologized to his family, including his brother David, who attended the execution. "I hope this brings peace. I don't want them to worry about me anymore." He was pronounced dead at 7:26 p.m. Lee Hall was 53 years old. And that brings us to the last death row inmate executed in 2019. On the morning of January 29, 2003, inside the Clements Unit Prison in Amarillo, Travis Runnels stood behind Stanley Wiley, a civilian supervisor working in the prison's boot factory. Without warning, Travis grabbed Stanley by the head, yanked it back, and dragged a knife across his throat. The wound was brutal, 23 centimeters long, slicing through the external carotid artery, the internal jugular, and down to the spine. Stanley collapsed and died shortly after. Travis had told other inmates that morning he was angry. He wanted out of janitorial work and wasn't getting the transfer he asked for. According to testimony, he said he was going to kill someone, and that Stanley would be the one if he said anything to him. And Travis meant every word. After the killing, Travis walked away from Stanley's body, wiped the knife clean, and told another inmate it could have been any inmate, as long as they were white. When he was told he could face the death penalty, Travis shrugged. "A dead man can't talk," he said. At that point, Travis was already serving 70 years for aggravated robbery, with prior convictions for 2 burglaries. In prison, guards said he had thrown urine and feces and even hit a guard in the face once. But when it came time for trial, his guilt wasn't even a question. Travis had already pleaded guilty. The real fight was about his future. Would he be a danger behind bars? During sentencing, the state brought in A.P. Marilat, a prison investigator who had testified in other death penalty cases. Marilat later became known for giving false or misleading testimony, and in Travis's case, it was no different. Still, prosecutors leaned on Marilat's word to argue that Travis would continue to pose a threat behind bars. His defense team had almost nothing left to fight with. Family members who were supposed to testify for him, his mother, his grandmother, his brother, never showed up. Some made it to the courthouse but left before they could take the stand. With no family willing to defend him, his lawyers turned to the only people left, inmates who had seen him that day. 7 of them testified, saying Travis had been calm, peaceful, even cooperative after the killing. But it wasn't enough. Not against the brutal facts, not against the weight of what he'd done. So the jury gave him death. Over the next 14 years, Travis fought the sentence, arguing Marilat's false testimony should be enough to halt his execution. But the courts didn't agree. When his day came, Travis wasn't allowed a special final meal and ate the same food as every other inmate. On December 11, 2019, Travis was strapped to the gurney in Texas's death chamber. His hands remained still and he offered no final words. But just before the drugs flowed, he blew kisses toward 3 female friends and 2 of his attorneys, then let out a loud woof woof across the room. At 7:04 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital entered his bloodstream, and 22 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Travis Runnels was 46 years old. That concludes all executions carried out in 2019. If you liked this video, make sure to check out the next one, because just when you thought it couldn't get worse, well, it can. And the next cases are even more disturbing.